My name is Jeff Stepnisky. I'm an associate professor of sociology at MacEwan University. The title of the paper I'm giving today is Cosmopolitan Identity on the Maidan. Though it has a long history, over the last 10 years the concept of cosmopolitanism has attracted renewed attention in social and political theory. In this paper, I rely upon sociologist Ulrich Beck's theory of cosmopolitanism to describe what I will call cosmopolitan identity on the Maidan. What I want to suggest is that Euromaidan can be interpreted as a cosmopolitan revolution, inspired by or that gives rise to what we might call Ukrainian cosmopolitan identities. This emphasis on cosmopolitanism is meant to counter exclusively nationalist interpretations of Maidan. To start, let me say a few words about Beck's characterization of cosmopolitanism. First and foremost, Beck is critical of what he calls normative cosmopolitanism. Normative cosmopolitanism is what usually comes to mind when we hear the term cosmopolitanism. It is the cosmopolitanism that springs from the Enlightenment ideal of a harmonious social and political order subsumed under a shared morality. According to Beck, this is the yet-to-be-realized and oftentimes fantastical cosmopolitanism of philosophers and social elites. It is certainly not the kind of cosmopolitanism that he observes today. In contrast to normative cosmopolitanism, Beck focuses on what he calls real cosmopolitanism, or actually existing cosmopolitanism. This is the kind of cosmopolitanism that, according to him, can be empirically investigated. Examples can be brought forth. This is a cosmopolitanism that is closely connected to, it is the product of processes of globalization, the kind that have been so thoroughly studied by sociologists, political scientists, economists over the last 15 to 20 years. This cosmopolitanism grows out of global interdependence and interconnectedness. It includes, for example, the economic interconnectedness wrought by late capitalism, the political interconnectedness expressed in organizations such as the United Nations, European Union, Amnesty International. It also includes the cultural interconnectedness that follows from the widespread use of electronic and social media. Real cosmopolitanism does not assume a normative order or set of ideals. Instead, quite modestly I think, it tries to describe the many and oftentimes contradictory ways that humans across the planet are interconnected and therefore interdependent in the late 20th and 21st century. So to describe Maidan as a cosmopolitan revolution means that we draw attention to the many ways in which the spirit of Maidan, the practices of Maidan, the identities cultivated in the midst of Maidan are connected to both national but then also global currents and ideals. So this is the starting. What I want to turn to now is just briefly some of the broad features that might tempt us in the beginning to characterize Maidan as cosmopolitanism. For example, the revolution was initially driven by a desire for the kind of cosmopolitanism presumably exemplified by the European Union. The European Union is oftentimes cited as a model of the kind of cosmopolitanism discussed in these debates. Later, about 2 weeks into the protests, the goals of the protests shifted to concerns around problems of corruption, human rights, and dignity. These remain, according to Beck, cosmopolitan ideals as well, as I'll explain further in a moment. Finally, the cosmopolitan character of the revolution is also found in the central role played by social media in the Maidan. Social media not only connected Ukrainians to one another, but they brought the Maidan to a global audience. These three broad concerns aside, I want to now focus on three particular concepts in order to better flesh out or test this cosmopolitan character of Maidan. First, cosmopolitanism, according to Beck, includes a self-conscious recognition of global interconnectivity. The cosmopolitan theorist does not only remark upon the ways in which the world is interconnected, but it also seeks to describe the way in which people are becoming aware of or conscious of those connections. To this end, I would suggest to you, and I make this suggestion based on some documentaries that I've viewed, newspaper interviews with protesters, at least for some, the form of protest itself was cosmopolitan. That is, Ukrainians were not only allied with Ukrainians in the Maidan protests, but at least some saw themselves as part of a global community of protesters who were collectively seeking the overthrow of corruption and dictatorial rule. This was particularly the case with the student and youth side of the movement, who are internet savvy and therefore almost automatically connected to the planet. They also viewed themselves as connected to global social movements like Occupy and the Arab Spring. They borrowed images, techniques, and symbols from other protests around the world. Dr. Rocha earlier in the day described the way in which these anonymous masks that were part of the Occupy movement were used by Ukrainian protesters. So Maidan, at least for some, and at least in some instances, is cosmopolitan because it borrows its techniques and it shares a spirit with protest traditions from around the world. The second feature of cosmopolitanism on the Maidan that I want to flesh out here, it can be captured with the term cosmopolitan empathy. This is connected to one of the central concerns of or qualities of cosmopolitan consciousness, which is the focus on human rights. According to Beck, the respect for human rights is a cosmopolitan value because it shows a respect for human dignity that transcends national borders. The question of human rights has been front and center in the Maidan Revolution. For this reason, Euromaidan has also been referred to as the Revolution of Dignity. The Revolution of Dignity has an institutional component. Local, national, global human rights agencies made use of social media to draw attention to human rights abuses. But, and this is my interest in particular, there's also a psychosocial, or we might say emotional, component to these global human rights. Beck describes this with the term cosmopolitan empathy. In his book, Cosmopolitan Vision, he puts it this way: the space of our emotional imagination has expanded in a transnational sense. Television, news, and media now provide round-the-clock coverage of war, violence, and suffering. The suffering of others from distant locales are brought into everyone's homes. In this context, people from around the world are compelled to empathize with global suffering. Beck characterized this as a uniquely cosmopolitan emotion. The sharing of suffering, the cultivation of empathy. We can also see Euromaidan in this light. It was a revolution that depended upon, that worked to share and cultivate a capacity for empathy, the display of emotion, and the assaults upon human dignity found in Ukraine. For example, in preparing this paper, I relied heavily upon the documentaries created by an independent film group working in Ukraine, Babylon 13. Babylon 13 expresses cosmopolitanism in a number of ways. First, like many of the Maidan media outlets, it was developed to share stories of Maidan with people living outside of Ukraine, in particular to a Western English-speaking audience. It reaches out to the world. Maidan is self-consciously connected to not only the West, but the entire planet. Second, many of the Babylon 13 videos stage human dramas with what I would characterize as a broadly human appeal. They're not uniquely Ukrainian stories, but rather play on striking and compelling interests and passions. Shame, for example, is a 2-minute long video. In it, a camera slowly passes over the face of Maidan riot police. They're all young men. As the camera passes over them, they look down, they look away, they look uncomfortable, presumably because they're ashamed of their role in the conflict. Whatever the interpretation, though, the point here is that the video attempts to connect the assaults of Yanukovych's government with a global emotion, shame, human dignity, and thereby cultivate empathy more generally. The last concept that I want to explore, quite briefly, we'll call cosmopolitan nationalism. Unlike older varieties of cosmopolitan theory, Beck's version does not exclude nationalism. This is important for Maidan because clearly symbols of Ukrainian nationalism played an important role in defining the movement. We can't ignore those. We have to make sense of them within the cosmopolitan framework. For Beck, cosmopolitanism does not transcend or do away with once and for all national identity. Rather, in an interconnected cosmopolitan order, nationalism intersects with, it influences, and is influenced by the global. I have time only for one quick example. Ukrainian pop star Ruslana played a central role on the Maidan. Indeed, in the first month of the protests, there were many Western stories profiling her. Now, of course, Ruslana is a cultural bridge between Europe and Ukraine. She's the winner of the Eurovision music competition. But at the same time, on the Maidan, she stood on stage and proudly, night after night, sang the Ukrainian anthem. I don't have time to complete the analysis, but what's required here is an understanding of what kind of Ukrainian identity Ruslana inspires. She is once a patriot and a cosmopolitanism. In Beck's version of cosmopolitanism, these are not opposed to one another. They don't tear her apart, or so I assume, but rather they intermingle as part of her expression of Ukrainian identity. I've come to the end of my time now. I guess the general point that I want to make is the analysis of any kind of protest, any kind of national movement, any kind of human expression in the contemporary moment requires, if we follow back this cosmopolitan framing. I've tried to show you a little bit of how that might be done, but of course there's much more to be done here. Thank you for your time and your attention.